watching Cron On, streaming now from Cron 4, the Bay Area's local news station.
Thanks for joining us here on Cron On. I'm Noelle Bello. The U.S. Federal Trade Commission can proceed with an antitrust lawsuit against Meta, the company formerly known as Facebook. A federal judge gave the FTC the green light after dismissing the suit just last year. To help us understand what this means for Meta, CNET's editor-at-large Ian Scher joining us now to discuss. Ian, why the okay now after dismissing the lawsuit already last year? Does it have to do at all with the name change of the company?
No, although that would be interesting if the judge thought the name was stupid and that's why the lawsuit could continue. No, unfortunately, it has to actually come to a lot of the inside baseball of Washington, D.C. The original complaint that the FTC brought against Facebook was not considered to be good enough, essentially, to really fight up against what Facebook had as a company. And the judge said, look, this doesn't have enough to clear the bar of a lawsuit that could continue, an antitrust lawsuit. And so tossed it out, but allowed the FTC to refile. And they did later in the year last year. So now this is the result of that, right? Facebook, once the FTC refiled, which was, the first time that the FTC had filed under its new head, who it comes from the Biden White House and is known as an antitrust real kind of focused on Silicon Valley. Essentially, the judge said this has enough to be able to go through trial. Didn't say whether or not how the ruling would go and how the trial would turn out, but the arguments made in it worked at least enough for the judge to say, I'm not going to toss it out again, which is what Facebook wanted.
Well, the lawsuit does aim to break up Meta. What does that actually mean? Like, what can the FTC actually do?
We honestly don't know. None of us have really been in this type of situation with the tech industry before. We've seen efforts before to break up tech companies, right? Most notably Microsoft back 20 years ago. But what happened in that case was that even though the judge declared Microsoft a monopoly, you may remember, they essentially just slapped the company on the wrist and let it continue being Microsoft. Nothing changed. AT&T is another example, right? A company that was broken up into a lot of what a lot of people remember as baby bells, right? Instead of Ma Bell. And what ended up happening over the period of 20 years is it just reconsolidated into what it is today, AT&T. So I don't really know what would change in this regard. The FTC is at least trying to look at whether or not Facebook should have been allowed to acquire companies like Instagram, which is now one of the world's largest social networks, specifically focused on photos, or WhatsApp, which is extremely popular outside the United States for text messaging. But when you think about what Facebook is at this point, right, it's really hard to tell how do you break up this company and what would you do? And unwinding decisions that were made 10 years ago is very tough.
So this does have the potential to affect its platforms. Does that mean it has the potential to affect users of the platforms?
I mean, in theory, anything is up for grabs, right? Let's say that the judge and this whole process does lead to Facebook being broken up, right? And suddenly we have the idea of Facebook, the big blue app that we all use, but also WhatsApp as an entirely different company and Instagram as an entirely different company from that. A lot of the interconnections that the companies built over the years to make those things work would probably start to fall apart. Stuff like, for example, I can message between different apps these days. That's something that Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Meta, really wanted to do. That might fall apart. Other things, right? There are possibilities all over the place. Not to mention that Instagram and WhatsApp are not the cash cows that Facebook is in the same level. So they would also operate differently. So all those things are really huge questions that the judges would have to figure out.
Facebook's the cash cow it is because of the ads, correct?
Advertising is what the name of the game is, and Facebook is one of the best at it.
Yeah. I know this is just one of a number of legal actions against Facebook's parent company at this point. Do you see this just being an ongoing issue, more and more lawsuits over and over again?
Well, at one point, what's going to end up happening is that at least when it comes to the FTC, right, the Federal Trade Commission, whose job is to police antitrust issues, for them, this is probably the biggest bite they're going to make at this apple, right? That they really want to figure out how do we figure out when Facebook has done wrongly, when it's harmed consumers, and what it's supposed to do. You have to also keep in mind that the idea around antitrust law is changing radically. It used to be that antitrust was considered something where prices were kept artificially high to hurt you and me, right? To force us to pay more. I don't pay anything for Facebook, right? So how do you define how it's hurting me? And those are really different ideas that the new head of the FTC is trying to feel out and argue, but it requires a very big change from the way things have been done. So all of this stuff is very unclear right now. All we know for sure is that they've been able to convince a judge to move forward with this lawsuit, which is a step more than they were before when they were kicked out of court.
A personal opinion question for you. Should Meta scale back, do you think?
One of the things that I think is really tough is that we can't tell how much impact Meta, Facebook, all of these companies have had on the tech industry if they had acted differently, right? Let's imagine a world where Facebook did not acquire Instagram or didn't buy WhatsApp or even Oculus, right? The VR headset company. How different would the world be? It's really hard to tell. And these what ifs are part of what that lawsuit is about. But we have to really ask ourselves, when it comes to the advancement of business and the advancement of the tech industry in general, what's right or wrong and when is it anti-competitive behavior or not? And I think a lot of people, even today, right, 20 years after Microsoft, it's really unclear, which is why this is such a fascinating case, honestly.
Definitely. Well, we'll be watching. Ian Scher, editor-at-large for CNET. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Always.